I learned everything I know about cameras deep in the YouTube trenches, actually making and posting videos that were riddled with mistakes and questionable decisions, which is why I want to share 3 camera settings or maybe concepts that I wish I used sooner. Now, this isn't going to be an in-depth guide that goes deep into the technicalities. Instead, I'm hoping this will offer a starting point that you can either go out and start experimenting with these settings if you've never heard of them before, or if you're interested in something, be able to go search for it and dig deeper. Because at least for me, I didn't even know these things existed when I started making YouTube videos. So let's start with autofocus. Continuous autofocus and subject tracking have become increasingly impressive over the years, but the problem is that the autofocus is constantly searching for the subject. So if your scene changes, the focus might too. I see this in YouTube videos all of the time. B-roll shots where the autofocus jumps around unintentionally. And I'll use my little iron cow here as an example. So my autofocus, my continual autofocus is set on him, but if something goes in front of him, like my hand, the camera will refocus on my hand and then refocus back to him. So if I was trying to reach across and grab my little kaonashi here, the focus will change back and forth when maybe I didn't want that to happen. The good news is that there's a really simple fix for this, and that's to use a single autofocus mode, often seen as AF-S. And it's particularly powerful when you pair it with a spot or area focus mode, something where we have a little box around our subject. So I can move this box around in the scene to tell the camera exactly what I want to be focusing on. I can half press on the shutter button here, and what that will do is turn my box green, hopefully, to let me know that the subject is in focus. Now, once I press record, nothing can change the focus anymore. So I can reach in front of my little cow here, grab my little kaonashi figurine, and nothing's gonna happen, even if I block where the focus should be, because it's not continually trying to find focus again. You find focus once and then it stays. And this is probably my absolute favorite focus mode. And even if I move my cow, like nothing happens. Put my cow back, and it's really that easy. The DJI Pocket 3 has a single autofocus mode where you can tap on the subject and then it won't change. And with a smartphone, you can get similar results by using an autofocus lock. On my iPhone, all I have to do is hold down my finger on the subject and I'll get this AEAF lock confirmation. Now, no matter what I do, the focus will stay here until I tap on something else to end the lock. So when you're shooting any kind of scene where you don't want the autofocus to suddenly change, to pulse, or get confused, then single autofocus modes are a quick, easy way to do that. And they are so much more reliable than continuous autofocus. Next, let's talk about exposure, or how bright your image is. Exposure compensation is a quick and easy way to make your image brighter or darker when you're using a fully or semi-automatic shooting mode. In automatic modes, the camera is making a lot of choices for you, and it's trying to get a balanced image, not too bright and not too dark. And most cameras have this little EV gauge or number to represent this. So when your camera is doing work in an auto mode, this number will be balanced out to 0. But if you're looking at the image and thinking that maybe it's too bright, you can darken the image by lowering the EV into the negatives, even if you don't quite understand what's technically happening in the camera. This works great for backlit scenes when you really want to preserve the background and make the subject darker. I shoot a lot in manual modes now, but I still really enjoy using this feature on the DJI Pocket, my phone, and action cameras. I find that the Pocket and action cameras expose images just slightly brighter than I want them to be. I like to be very careful about my highlights since I film a lot outdoors and I typically do want my sky and my clouds to have a little detail in them if I can. So I often go into the camera and lower the exposure compensation to around -0.3 or -0.5, just right off the bat as soon as I buy the camera. And I find that this gives me just a little more control in post when I'm inevitably tweaking the exposure and the colors. especially because these small compact cameras typically don't have the same tools that you might find on a mirrorless camera to help you make sure that your image is being well exposed. You kind of just have to look at it, and that's why I like to lower the exposure compensation just a little to be careful. On my iPhone, I can actually tap and then pull this little lever down to adjust the exposure as well, which I find extra helpful when I'm dealing with very contrasty images, very bright brights and dark darks, because I often find that the camera will overexpose certain images that I want to be dark. Now, of course, you can use exposure compensation to make an image darker, but that also means you can use the same tool to make your image brighter. However, this is something I truly rarely do. When it comes to making an image brighter, there's just a lot more that can go wrong while the camera tries to brighten the image. Like introducing a lot of noise, these little dots here, or slowing the shutter speed down too much and giving us a lot of unwanted motion blur. Especially if you're new to filmmaking and don't really understand how all of these different numbers affect your image. But it does happen, because sometimes it's just the director's choice. This setting is mapped out a little bit differently depending on the camera you have. Some cameras have dials, others have buttons, sometimes it's inside the menu options. But once you know where it is a fast and easy way to quickly adjust the brightness of your image when you're working in a fully or semi-automatic shooting mode. It's also a great way to experiment and dial in that brightness to suit your tastes or creative needs. And finally, let's talk about backgrounds. YouTube has absolutely spoiled us with high-quality B-roll and big blurry compressed backgrounds for years now. And a lot of creators do use something like a $2,000 G Master lens to get these shots. So for a very long time, I truly believed that the only way for me to get that kind of background blur and compression was to buy a very expensive lens with a wide aperture or a low f-stop. And while lower f-stops definitely can increase the background blur in your image, it's actually a little more complicated than that. Bokeh, that beautiful blur in the background, and compression when the background seems just very big, flat, and close to the subject despite being far away, those actually appear more as a relationship between aperture, focal length, and distance. Both the distance of the subject to the camera lens, but also the distance of the subject to the background. So manipulating this trifecta, this relationship, is the way to get blurrier backgrounds and more compression. But that relationship can be a lot to understand or even remember for some beginners, which is why I absolutely love this technique, because you can do it right away, you don't have to dig too deep into the technicalities, and you don't need an expensive lens. You can do this on the kit lens that maybe you bought with your first camera, or even on your phone. It's super simple. Literally all you have to do is step back and zoom in. That's it. So let's take Kaonashi to the kitchen to see this in action. Okay, so we have Kaonashi up front in focus, and we have a little bit of tea in the back corner there to demonstrate, and all we're gonna do is take the camera, we're gonna bring it back and zoom in. We're gonna try to get a kind of similar framing to what we had before. And now what we should see is the tea looking a little bit bigger than it was before, and also closer, as well as probably a good deal blurrier. And now if we want to make the background even blurrier, we can try to create some distance between the tea and Kaonashi by bringing Kaonashi forward. Try to bring this back to get a similar framing and see what that looks like. And finally, one more thing we can do to try to make that background look even blurrier is get the subject closer to the lens and just bring it nice and close. And now that background should look pretty big and blurry. And now that I'm editing this, I did want to add another note, and that's that I think because so much of the conversation on YouTube about YouTube use case specific lenses revolves around these low apertures and also wide zoom lenses or wide prime lenses, something that you can really just pick up and hold out and talk to. I think there's a lot of focus on the benefit of the wide end of the focal length spectrum that for a long time I really missed out and underutilized tight shots and detail shots, and I just didn't realize how much value or how much creativity, maybe performance is the right word, or versatility. I just certainly underutilized the tighter end of the focal range when it came to using my kit lens, and I wish I started zooming in a lot faster. And of course, it does come down to preferences and standards, but I do think you can get some decent blur and compression right from a standard kit zoom lens that comes or can come with a lot of entry-level bodies, which I think is great. This same concept also works with phones. When I take the picture up close and wide, the background looks pretty far away and not too blurry, but when I back up and zoom in to take the photo, the background's looking a little bit bigger. But if we then zoom in by moving the camera closer, you can see the background gets a bit blurrier than it was before. We should be able to do this with the pocket as well. Just coming closer to the lens should help the background become a little bit blurrier. And that's it. Single autofocus, exposure compensation, and zooming in were the three things I really wish I understood sooner, or at least started experimenting with. Hopefully this video can act as a starting point for you to either start experimenting or dig deeper. Either way, I hope you enjoyed the video.